We have seen an argument for affirmative action by Mosley. So now we're going to consider an argument against a particular form of affirmative action by Celia Wolf-Devine. This is the stronger version, right, that Mosley also argued for. That's more than just advertising opportunities and making sure that hiring and other processes are fair, but actually favoring people based on uh, race or gender and other. So this is Celia Wolf-Devine. As I said, she sticks to this sort of distinction between what she calls preferential and procedural affirmative action. So procedural is the kind that just says, let's make sure that there's no one is disadvantaged, right, in the process of awarding these opportunities. Whereas preferential affirmative action says, if you're a woman or person of color, that's a plus, right? That goes in the pro column in the hiring process, and that counts for you. Um, so she says, if you count gender or racial identity um, as one of the reasons for hiring someone, and if right, you potentially would hire them over like a white man, right, who was equally qualified, then she says you're engaging in preferential affirmative action, and this is the kind of affirmative action that she wants to argue against. Now she says that preferential affirmative action is not necessarily a problem in itself and in all cases, right? The problem is that for her is when it's applied to certain types of opportunities that are zero sum, right? So that is, right, if one person gets hired, the other person doesn't, right? So a win, you can't have a winner without a loser, right? That's a zero sum game. Um, so those are the situations she thinks that make preferential affirmative action a problem, right? It amounts to denying certain people opportunities on the basis of their gender or racial identity. Um, Other sorts of policies, right, conceivably wouldn't have this problem. Scholarships, low interest loans, special training. Um, you could see situations where these are awarded on the basis of gender or racial identity, and it's not as worrisome. Now, one point that Wolf-Devine wants to take some time at the outset to argue is that we can't treat gender and race uh, as equivalent when it comes to affirmative action. Um, and this, I think, is commonly accepted that there are various what we call, axes of oppression, right? Um, and some people have exist on these sort of intersecting axes, right? So you could be a woman, right? Women have been oppressed in various ways. You could be a black woman, right? Black people have been oppressed in various ways. You could be a black LGBTQ plus woman, right? And so you're existing on these three axes of oppression. Um, and Wolf-Devine wants to say we need to pull at least sort of a couple of these apart when it comes to affirmative action because she thinks they should be treated in different ways, right? Um, so black people, for example, they have a history of slavery, codified discrimination, right? There were laws that determined, right, what black people could and couldn't do. Um, this is different than the experience of, say, like Latinos, Hispanic immigrants, right? And she argues that really they're not so different than the European immigrants that came to the U.S. in terms of like the sorts of at least, at very least, the sorts of legal discrimination, right, that were codified. Now, one thing she misses is that skin color can be very important, right, in how people are treated. So, um, if you're a European immigrant, right, or a Latino immigrant, um, sure, there may not be this. You weren't enslaved, probably, right, at any point, any of your ancestors, and there was maybe not the same kind of legal discrimination. But I would argue that skin color matters, right? Um, so she points out that in the U.S., women and racial minorities have been sort of linked together under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, where she says this is actually sort of a peculiarly U.S. This is a thing that happened in the United States. Um, it's not necessarily the case in other countries, right? They don't identify these as sort of the same uh, as far as like oh, discrimination and hiring and things like that. Um, and she wants to say that really, at the very least, like if you take the situation of women and the situation of black people, um, that's actually very different in important ways, right? So some women are white, black, rich, working class. Um, and you might, for example, think that if you're trying to help right people with affirmative action, maybe you don't need to help women CEOs, right? There's some very wealthy, very powerful women out there at this point. Um, right? Maybe you need to concentrate on the working class. Again, class is another axis, right, of oppression that you may need to pry apart. She goes on to argue that the strongest arguments for affirmative action for black people, in her view, don't carry over to women. So, like, for example, being a woman isn't passed on through generations, right? If you're a woman, that doesn't mean that your children will all be women. Um, Women don't live in gender segregated communities like the way that some minority groups have been, um, or racial groups, I mean, have been, right? Women historically typically share the social class of their fathers and husbands. Um, as we said, some women are rich or poor. I mean, in the past, it had followed whether their father or husband was rich or poor, right? Within these sort of classes, women were, I think, probably arguably a subordinate class within that class. But it's different, is all she's saying, right? From racial groups in the way that it propagates through generations. So there's not the same sort of historical buildup of economic hardship generation to generation that happened with black people. Now you could argue there's other kinds of hardships, right, and other kinds of historical buildups of hardships that are just as bad for women. Um, but she has a point that they're different, at least, right? And she wants to argue, and this point you may push back on, is that given that the situation is different and there's not the same sort of multi-generational historical buildup of disadvantages, that maybe in the case of women, maybe all you would need is the weaker form of affirmative action, right? As long as you're not discriminating in the hiring process, then that might be fine in the case of women. That might be a point you might want to push back on in an essay, right? She doesn't give, she gives some reasons, but like I can see a lot of ways you could um, maybe attack that if you wanted to. So continuing with the case of women, this distinction between sort of trying to pull apart various means of oppression, gender, right, and racial category. Um, she says you might not want or need gender parity, right? So by parity, well, it's a little pretty easy with the case of men and women because each is about 50% of the population. I think women are like 51%, right? Um, so gender parity would mean if half the population is women, then half of every profession should be women. She's saying, I don't, you may not want that or even need that, right? So as long as you're, again, if you have this procedural affirmative action where women aren't unfairly prevented from joining or unfairly considered in the hiring process, um, maybe it doesn't matter so much if half of our firefighters and mathematicians are women, right? Um, and in fact, right, if you had to sort of change the physical requirements for certain jobs, right? So you had to, for firefighters, for example, right, there are certain physical requirements. There are certainly physical differences, often between, sort of on average, between men and women. She thinks that could be dangerous, right, if you had to lower the standards. Um, and also, she says, since men and women often share the expenses in a household, um, for affirmative action with when applied to women, what you might end up with is that the job that would have gone to a white man just goes to his white wife, right? And so you're just shuffling the same income in the same household. She says I mean, maybe that could have some positive benefits, right, within the household, but she thinks that she's assuming that the goal of affirmative action is sort of a broader and more robust redistribution of opportunities, um, right, among groups, not just sort of moving money around in the same house. All right, so she's made those points about what she thinks are the differences between, right, gender and race when it comes to affirmative action. Maybe there's some opportunities to write a paper in there for you if you disagree with any of those premises. Um, all that said, she's going to do, now this is typically a very good sort of uh, argumentative strategy. She wants to take the strongest case and then argue against that case. And when you write your paper, that's something you want to do, right? You don't want to just pick the weakest argument that you find and knock it down. That doesn't really impress anybody, right? Take what you think is a strong argument and then try to refute it. So that's what she's doing. She thinks obviously that, right, black people in America have a very strong case for preferential affirmative action, right? If anybody has a case for it, black people in America do, right? Um, First off, she wants to, as a sort of a quick note, she wants to make some points about statistics, right? So you may recall that Mosley argues, or part of his argument for affirmative action is he points out all these statistics about the various disparities between racial groups, right? Income, incarceration, and so on. And Wolf-Devine says, um, I mean, statistics, they're data, right? They can be used as evidence, but you do need to view them with a critical eye and be careful. Um, So take one example, right? Um, and maybe not all the statistics uh, are problematic in this way, but she says you do need to think twice when you look at statistics. Here's her example. If you looked at mortgage approval rates, right, you would see that more often whites are approved for mortgages than other racial groups. And again, that might seem like discrimination, right? She says, well, if you dig into the data, you'll actually find that um, white people on average have higher incomes, right, than non-white people and more assets than non-white people. Um, and if you actually only looked at the approved mortgages, you would find that when minority applicants are approved, they are approved even though they have on average lower income and assets, right, relative to the loan. Uh, so there's certainly a problem here. This disparity in income and assets, that seems like a problem for sure, right? And that may be the result of discrimination. But if you look at the actual mortgage approval process, it does look like the loan officers are trying to approve minority applications when they can, right? Even they're giving them the loans, even though they have the lower incomes. Um, finding you find a disparity, and that may suggest discrimination in the world somewhere, but it can be hard to locate where the discrimination is and make assumptions. Is her point. All right, so back to the argument for affirmative action. So just as Mosley spent a fair amount of time trying to knock down arguments against affirmative action, she's going to try to knock down some arguments for affirmative action. This is a perfectly legitimate way to write your paper, right? Which is like considering an argument against your view and refuting it. Okay, so she says the basic principle behind the compensatory argument for affirmative action that if you wrong someone, you owe them, right? And you owe them in that you are required to restore them to the position they enjoyed before you hurt them, right? Um, Now, this is complicated, as we've seen in the case of affirmative action, because the wrongs are now several, if not many, generations ago. Right? But nonetheless, black people do have a strong case to some form of compensation. Um, Again, we know their ancestors, right, in many cases were abducted, brought here, held in slavery, and even after the end of slavery, right, the Jim Crow laws in the South, which I explained, those were those discriminatory laws um, in the South that prevented black people from building wealth, right? You couldn't buy a home in certain neighborhoods, you couldn't have certain jobs, so on, right? That prevented them from building status up to the mid 1960s, at least, right? So Wolf-Devine concedes this is obviously a wrong, right? Obvious harm was inflicted, and there is a strong claim that compensation is owed. So she is, again, this is a good, um, we've seen Mosley do it as well, and other authors. Give the best version of your opponent's argument, right? Again, that will make your argument look stronger if you can then refute it. Okay, so question then, she concedes there has been a wrong. Compensation is owed, right? But the question is, what's the best way to provide that compensation? Um, is it by disfavoring a particular white candidate for a particular job? Is that the way to repay this wrong? Well, she points out people on the entry-level job market right now um, have never owned a slave, and they certainly have not directly benefited from Jim Crow laws, right? There may still be people alive that have benefited from the Jim Crow laws, but they are now very old, right? Um, and she says it's even pretty unlikely that a given white person on the job market even benefited indirectly from these injustices, right? Certainly is the case of slavery, right? Most white people before the Civil War could not afford slaves. That was a fairly elite thing, right? So the vast majority of people don't have ancestors that own slaves. And even those that did own slaves actually didn't actually make much money, right? It wasn't in many cases not the most profitable enterprise. And then there was the Civil War, and most slave owners were financially ruined after the Civil War anyway. So whatever unjust gains they may have made, right, by owning slaves were wiped out and not passed on to their ancestors. And in fact, the vast majority of white people's ancestors moved here in the waves of post-war immigration from Europe, right? They probably look something like the folks in the picture, not particularly wealthy. So that's she argued in the last slide, right, that probably a given white person, I mean, overwhelmingly probably a given white person on the job market today did not benefit indirectly from slavery. It's much more likely that that given person uh, could have benefited unfairly, or that at least their ancestors had, from the discrimination that continued up into the 50s and 60s. I think, as I said in the last lecture, it's probably almost certain that my grandfather, right, when he got his job selling slippers, right, in upstate New York, um, black people were not considered, right, for his job. So there was a smaller pool of applicants that he was chosen from. He didn't have to compete with people of different races because they just weren't going to be hired. Okay, so that's certainly a possibility, right? But can we know whether that's true in any individual case, right? And the further we move along in history, the further in the past that discrimination happened, the harder it gets to make the case that this particular white applicant owes something to the applicant, right? Now, if you have specific knowledge of a particular injustice that was perpetrated by your ancestors that benefited you, there is certainly probably a moral obligation on you to make amends for that. Right? And Mosley makes that argument. You can't just, right, steal money and then give it to your children, and then your children are off scot-free. And if you know about a wrong in advance of that sort, you're obligated to prevent it. But Wolf-Devine says these are intuitions about one-to-one injustices, right? So if we know about them, yeah, that's fairly clear cut. Um, but she says it's not at all obvious that that should apply to big picture societal injustices, right? Does some particular white person who's applying for a job um, owe uh, a black person that's applying for the same job recompense, right? Because in the past, white people have mistreated black people, but we can't, in that certain case, maybe we don't know, right, if there's any direct causal line from those injustices to those particular people. Because um, we maybe shouldn't apply, again, our one-to-one intuition to these broader issues. Well, that's the compensation argument, and I think that's probably the strongest case, right? And she says there may be reason to doubt that preferential affirmative action is the right kind of justice to apply in that case, even though she agrees that some justice is needed, right? Um, but maybe it's not in the form of preferential affirmative action. So she goes on to consider some other arguments. One she calls the cultural damage argument. So this doesn't necessarily rely on intuitions about one-to-one injustice, right? And then, as she thinks, possibly misapplying them to broader societal issues. She says, look, it is plausible that if you enslave a group of people and discriminate discriminate against them systematically for hundreds of years, um, you have harmed their culture in some way. Splintering families, you're denying them money, you're denying them investment opportunities, and generally taking away all these wealth building practices that develop in a culture. So even when those people are emancipated, and even when uh, right these discriminatory practices are no longer encoded in law, um, the culture still has to start from scratch, sort of building up these processes of these practices of wealth building. That's plausible, but Wolf-Devine says the problem with this argument is that, in a sense, it sort of admits that one culture is not as good as other cultures at certain types of jobs, right? It's saying, well, they've been harmed, they haven't been able to practice or build up these practices. Um, when she's saying, okay, unfortunately, that says that in any given case, because you're part of a certain culture, you're worse at certain things, right? And she says that's probably not your view if you're arguing for affirmative action, right? So if you want to argue for affirmative action, this cultural damage argument is probably not going to be one you'll want to use. Right? You're not going to want to say, because someone's from another culture, right, they're somehow deficient in. She considers another sort of more metaphysical argument. So this is actually sort of uh, this is her arguing against affirmative action on from a certain concept of personal identity, and it's the one we considered last week, right? What makes you the person you are? It seems like the particular combination of gametes, right, from your particular parents, right, conceiving in a particular month, right? If it had been slightly different, a different person, a different time, it wouldn't be you, right? You would call that conception of personal identity. So the argument goes, even though it was a harm to enslave people, if that hadn't happened, right, then the current generation of people probably wouldn't exist, right? People were brought over against their will to the United States. They met in the United States and right and conceived children. Um, if that harm of enslavement hadn't happened, those same pairs of people probably not wouldn't have met. Um, you wouldn't have then the same people now, right? Um, so she says no harm has been inflicted on the current generation because if we look at the counterfactual, right, where their ancestors weren't enslaved, then they just would never have been born. So there's no, again, they're not worse off. Now we saw some, right, some much more subtle arguments about those sorts of cases, right, in the argument that Benatar's argument that coming to existence is always a harm. So this is a premise that could be pushed on, right, potentially in a paper. But at least Wolf-Devine is assuming a certain account of harm where you make someone worse off, and she's saying, well, there's no making them worse off, right? Um, they wouldn't exist had it not been for slavery. Um, Now she considers a response to this argument that Mosley, in a different article, not the one we read, considers, and he tries to flesh out this counter. Says, okay, suppose slavery never happened, um, what would be the situation of black people in the U.S. right now? And he argues that they would have probably come in with the later waves of immigration, along with the Irish and German and Italian people, and they would be in a better situation now. But Wolf-Devine says there's a lot of ways you could cash out the counterfactual story, but she's sticking to her guns on this account of personal identity. Says maybe that's true, but they wouldn't be the same people. So again, um, you haven't harmed them because you haven't made them worse off. Because in the other situation, they just didn't exist, and that's not worse off. Not a state that you can even be in to compare. All right, so since we're talking about these counterfactuals, right, and by counterfactual I mean just sort of hypothetical situations of good things have been different. Right? Wolf-Devine takes a little break from analyzing these arguments for and against affirmative action and considers what is the goal, anyways? What are we trying to accomplish with preferential affirmative action? Um, Presumably, we want things to look the way they would if the injustice hadn't occurred, right? We want to, yeah, make it so the injustice never occurred, right? Or at least um, bring people back, make them whole. So Mosley And again, now she's considering again another article by Mosley, right? Not the one we read. But he admits we can't know what that situation would look like with any certainty. What would the world be like if these injustices hadn't occurred? What's the goal? What are we trying to make the world like now by fixing it, right? Um, he says, well, we can't really know. So the only fair assumption is that there would be equal representation. So if black people were 30% of the population, then 30% of the lawyers are going to be black. 30% of CEOs should be black. Now, Wolf-Devine takes issue with that assumption, right? She says, well, in any given profession, actually, even if you take sort of discrimination out of the picture, people are going to cluster. The demographics of any given profession are actually pretty clumpy, right? So, for whatever reason, she doesn't speculate on why, right? But you may end up having more women in certain professions and more men in other professions and more black people in other professions, even if there were no discrimination. Um, so she thinks that's actually the assumption we should make. If there had not been slavery, we probably still wouldn't have um, equal representation. We would have people clustering around the sorts of things that they want to pursue, and that's just going to be just human nature. That's going to be sort of unequal, right? Okay, back to arguments for affirmative action. Now Wolf-Devine considers the corrective argument. Now, according to the corrective argument, the point of affirmative action is not to repay past wrongs, but to correct for existing bias in the system, right? So this argument says, no, things are still bad and we need to fix them now. The idea is that in hiring or awarding other opportunities, people have these implicit, right, ingrained, maybe even unconscious biases, right? And they're going to tend to want to hire white men because white men, right, they sort of exemplify some sort of stereotype they have in their mind of like the good candidate or whatever. And the corrective argument says we need to combat that by explicitly, right, demanding that we hire women and people of color, because otherwise your implicit biases are going to steer you towards the white guy in every situation or in most situations. Um, she thinks we should be very wary of attributing that sort of subconscious bias. This is a whole nother literature, right, on implicit bias. It's interesting. If you wanted to write a paper where you did a little more research, you could do a little bit of research on the implicit bias and see if you wanted to apply that to this situation. Um, and we don't have the time to get into it here, right? But it's sort of an open question to what degree we have these implicit biases. And the Wolf-Devine also claims we should also be careful about sort of retroactively labeling a hiring process as biased just because it doesn't produce, right, the desired sort of proportional racial mix. Because it could always be the case that it could be a perfectly fair process, and it just so happened in any given case that it ended up, right, with a not very diverse uh, group of employees. Sometimes that happens. She's claiming it doesn't always mean that there's bias in the system. Okay, another argument for affirmative action is the forward-looking argument, and this is sort of a consequentialist argument. It says if we um, use preferential affirmative action, there's going to be good consequences, the consequences that we want. First one, role models, right? So if we deliberately put um, minority people in prominent positions, this will show other minority people that it is possible and will encourage success, right? So Obama is about as right big a role model as you could have for black people in America. You can be president of the United States. Go out there, do whatever you want, right? The world is open to you. That's supposed to be the message, right? Wolf-Devine says, okay, maybe that's true. That's sort of an empirical question, right? Whether having role models does in fact encourage people um, to achieve. Um, but even if it's true, you don't need a general preferential affirmative action policy to accomplish it. You'd only need a few role models, right? Um, a black person as president of the United States, pretty good start, right? Um, and this is, I think, in general, I think Obama has like created this sort of or accentuated this sort of split between the ways people view racism, right? So you can see one view, and in the next lectures, we're going to talk about how do you define racism, right? But it's brought to the fore this distinction between sort of institutional racism and racism as just sort of personal bias. And in one sense, if a black man can become president, and some people want to say racism is over, right? You can achieve the highest heights, right? And other people want to say no, 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 it still permeates the system in lots of ways. Right? Okay, diversity is another goal, right? Another consequentialist goal that you might want to have, right? And sorry that you have to look at the Confederate flag in this picture, right? But the point is, right, she wants to say diversity in itself is not necessarily a good, right? It can cause a lot of conflict, and also like not all types of people are ones we want represented, right? So that's the point of this picture, right? You probably don't want one of these folks, right? You don't want to say, look, we need diversity, so one of these folks needs to come in and uh, teach a lecture, right, today. Um, right? Some people are sort of bad, some people are racist, some people are pedophiles. They don't need to be represented, right? So diversity in its own, she says, is not necessarily a virtue, right? Um, so maybe what you really sort of need, what you mean is cultural diversity, not just diversity sort of simplicator, but cultural diversity, right? But she says even with that, there are some cultures that seem to have, there are cultural practices that just seem bad, right? Infanticide, torture, things like that. So it's can be hard even to say that cultural diversity is necessarily an end in itself. Um, And also, this often, she thinks, can actually burden members of cultural groups, right? So if diversity is the aim, then sort of if I hire a Native American person for my job, all of a sudden now they are like sort of the token, right? They're viewed as like representing their group. That's really more pressure than you want to put on somebody, right? They should be able to act in their own interests, right? They're a person with their own views. They're not a sort of represent. They're not a walking representative of their racial group. So given that she thinks, look, there is injustice, it needs to be fixed, and she's just arguing that preferential affirmative action is not the ideal way to go after it. What is the ideal way? Um, she wants to say attacking the root causes, right? So are we trying to reduce poverty? Then let's target poverty, right? Um, Race and poverty are actually not perfectly correlated, right? And like with gender, right? She said, look, there's women CEOs, right? Are we? The point is not to help elite women, right? The point is to bring people up. So maybe we should look at sort of class instead, poverty. Um, and then she also says if you want to compensate Black people in particular for past injustices, then maybe invest in their communities, right? There is still a fair amount of sort of like, I don't know if you call it segregation, but localization, right? Of like, there are recognizable Black communities, right? Latino communities. Um, you can invest in those communities, their schools, right? Their hospitals, their healthcare. Um, if you want to come into contact with diverse groups, right? If diversity is a goal, racial diversity is one kind, but it's not the only kind, right? So affirmative action, she thinks, sort of papers over some problems, and I think she's really saying like class problems, I think, or problems of poverty. Um, and she thinks that if you want to create more opportunities, um, you don't want to just sort of like put a few people from different races in certain jobs, right? And in more bosses, right? Saying like, okay, if the CEO is a Black CEO, that's not fixing sort of the problems of, I guess, maybe capitalism or at least sort of this income disparity, right? We want to address problems from the bottom up and not just sort of paper over it by having a nice, diverse photo on your company website, right? She thinks that that will actually breed further racial resentment. So that's Wolf Design's approach. So now we've seen two arguments, right? We've seen Mosley's argument for preferential affirmative action, Wolf Devine's argument against it. Um, if any of this struck you, again, these first 2 weeks, I'm trying to introduce topics that I'm hoping you'll have some gut reaction, either for or against, right? Hopefully not too strong. Hopefully, I think you've all been able to sort of take all this information in without it being too painful. But it can be good to have a strong gut reaction. Ooh, that feels wrong to me. What's wrong with the argument, right? And then that's a good opportunity to write a paper. Um, so next we will talking about just the concept of racism more generally, and how actually do we define that?